The Valley of Death. The sun hung low over the Angolan highlands, casting long shadows across a landscape that had become a graveyard of broken promises. Captain Marcus Webb stood at the edge of what the locals called Devil's Garden, 17 square kilometers of earth so contaminated with landmines that even the birds seemed to avoid flying over it. He was 34 years old, a combat engineer with the United Nations peacekeeping forces, and he had seen enough death to fill several lifetimes. But nothing had prepared him for this assignment. "Sir," the survey team reported back. Lieutenant Rodriguez approached, her face drawn with exhaustion. "They estimate over 43 separate minefields in this sector alone. Soviet PFM-1s, American M14s, homemade devices. It's a nightmare." Marcus nodded slowly, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. The Civil War had ended 3 years ago, but its legacy remained buried beneath every footstep of soil. Families couldn't return to their farms. Children couldn't play in fields that should have been filled with laughter. The land itself had become an enemy. "What's our equipment status?" he asked. Rodriguez's silence told him everything he needed to know before she spoke. The mine detectors arrived, damaged. Water got into the electronics during transport. The replacement order is stuck in bureaucratic hell. Minimum 6 weeks, they say. The robotic units are deployed in the northern sector. We have nothing, sir. Marcus felt the weight of impossible decisions settling on his shoulders. In 6 weeks, how many more children would lose limbs? How many farmers would starve because they couldn't access their fields? The numbers weren't abstract. He'd spent the last month visiting the makeshift hospitals, seeing the consequences of patience. If this story of ingenuity and courage resonates with you, hit that subscribe button. What comes next will challenge everything you know about modern warfare. That evening Marcus walked through the village that bordered the minefields. The sun painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, and he found himself thinking of his grandmother's voice, reading from the worn Bible she kept by her bedside. She had raised him in rural Georgia after his parents died, teaching him that faith and wisdom often came from the most unexpected places. An old man sat outside a clay dwelling, methodically working on something Marcus couldn't quite make out. As he drew closer, he saw the elder was fashioning a long wooden pole, carefully binding it with strips of cloth at measured intervals. "You're the American engineer," the old man said in Portuguese, not looking up from his work. His hands were weathered, marked by decades of manual labor, but they moved with surprising precision. "I am," Marcus replied in the same language, a skill he'd acquired during his 2 years in country. "They say you need to clear the fields, but you have no machines." "That's right." The old man finally looked up, and Marcus was struck by the clarity in his gaze. "Before your machines, before your computers, we had wisdom. My father cleared fields during the colonial wars, not with metal detectors, with these." He held up the pole and gestured to a collection of stones arranged in a careful pattern on the ground. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, not dismissal, but curiosity. "Show me," he said, sitting down on the ground. What transpired over the next 3 hours would change everything. The old man's name was Antonio, and his method was deceptively simple yet profoundly sophisticated. The wooden poles, he explained, were calibrated to specific lengths, exactly the distance a man's arm could comfortably extend while lying prone. The stones were sorted by weight and density, each serving a particular purpose in the detection process. "The mines, they are pressure sensitive, yes?" Antonio said, "but they also disturb the earth. They sink differently than natural stone. They create patterns in the soil that eyes can see if the eyes know what to look for." He demonstrated on a small patch of cleared ground, placing objects at various depths, and showing Marcus how the surface responded: subtle depressions, unusual discoloration, vegetation growing in telltale patterns. "You mark the ground in a grid," Antonio continued, drawing lines in the dirt. "The pole extends your reach without putting your weight forward. The stones test pressure at angles. Light stones first, bouncing them to see the surface, then heavier to test deeper. The earth speaks if you listen." Marcus was trained in the most sophisticated mine-clearing technology in the world. He had certifications, degrees and years of field experience. Everything in his professional education told him this method was insane, dangerous, impossibly slow, but something deeper, a wisdom his grandmother had tried to instill in him, whispered differently. David and Goliath, he murmured. Antonio smiled. You know the story. Everyone knows the story. Boy with a sling defeats a giant with advanced armor and weapons. But do you know why? Antonio asked, his eyes twinkling. Not because God simply willed it, because David knew his tools better than Goliath knew his. David's stones were not primitive. They were appropriate. Goliath's bronze was not advanced, it was excessive. The question is never what tools you have, but whether you understand them completely. Marcus spent the night sketching diagrams, running calculations and wrestling with a decision that could cost lives, including his own. Captain Webb called a meeting of his engineering unit at 0600 hours. 23 men and women gathered in the canvas tent that served as their operations center, their faces showing varying degrees of confusion and concern at being assembled before dawn. Marcus stood before them with Antonio at his side and a collection of wooden poles and sorted stones arranged on a table. I know what you're thinking, Marcus began without preamble. Your commanding officer has lost his mind. Let me present our situation as clearly as possible. We have 43 active minefields, approximately 200,000 square meters of contaminated land, no functional detection equipment, no robotic support, and a population that cannot wait 6 weeks for bureaucracy to solve our problem. He paused, letting the reality settle over them. Antonio here is going to teach us a method that predates modern mine-clearing technology by several decades. It uses sticks, stones, and careful observation. I know how it sounds. I spent half the night trying to convince myself it was suicidal, but I also spent the other half running the mathematics, studying the principles, and comparing it to our modern doctrine. Lieutenant Rodriguez spoke up, her voice skeptical but respectful. Sir, with all due respect, our protocols exist for a reason. The casualty rates for manual mine clearing, even with proper equipment. I know the statistics, Lieutenant, which is why we're not going to use this method blindly. We're going to combine Antonio's traditional wisdom with our modern understanding of explosive ordnance. We're going to train, drill and test, until every person here could do this in their sleep, and we're going to establish safety protocols that exceed anything in the manual. If you want to see how ancient wisdom and modern science can combine to solve impossible problems, show your support by hitting that like button. You won't believe what happens next. The training began immediately. Antonio demonstrated the technique with a patience that reminded Marcus of his grandmother teaching him to read, breaking complex skills into manageable pieces, encouraging without condescension, correcting without criticism. The wooden poles were crafted from local hardwood, each one exactly 1.8 meters long, the length determined by the average arm reach plus safety margin. They were marked at 10-centimeter intervals with strips of colored cloth, creating a visual measurement system that could be read at a glance. The stones were sorted into 4 categories by weight: probes, 50-75 grams, testers, 100 to 150 grams, triggers, 200-300 grams, and markers, pure white stones of any size for permanent marking. Each served a specific function in the detection sequence. You start by observing, Antonio taught them. The ground tells stories. See here this discoloration? This is where water pools differently because something below interrupts the natural drainage. These plants? They grow stunted because the soil chemistry changed when metal was buried. This depression, too uniform to be natural settling. Marcus watched his team transform. The initial skepticism gave way to concentration, then to genuine fascination. Sergeant Johnson, a demolitions expert from Detroit, proved particularly adept at reading soil patterns. Corporal Martinez, who had grown up on a farm in Texas, understood immediately how vegetation responded to ground disturbance. They practiced on cleared ground first, with Antonio burying various objects, rocks, metal cans, wooden blocks, and challenging them to locate and identify each one using only the poles, stones and their observations. The success rate after 3 days of intensive training reached 9. But training isn't combat, Rodriguez pointed out during an evening briefing. We need a live test. Marcus had been dreading and anticipating this moment. I'll conduct the first clearance operation myself, alone. The protest was immediate and vocal. Rodriguez was the most vehement. That's suicide, sir, and you know it. You don't ask people to follow you into something you haven't proven. That's exactly what I'm doing, Marcus replied quietly. I'm proving it before I ask anyone else to risk their life. If the method works, I'll train everyone. If it doesn't, he didn't finish the sentence. Antonio placed a weathered hand on Marcus's shoulder. Pride is not wisdom, Captain. David did not face Goliath to prove himself. He faced Goliath because he understood his tools and his purpose. You have done the first, remember the second. The old man's words hit harder than any military reprimand. Marcus's purpose wasn't to be a hero, it was to clear the minefields, and that required not just his success, but the success of his entire team. You're right, he admitted. We do this together. Rodriguez, Johnson, Martinez, you're with me on the first clearance. 4-person team, maximum dispersal, strict protocols. We treat this as a combat operation with full documentation. The reconnaissance began at first light. They selected a relatively small field, approximately 800 square meters, known to contain a mix of anti-personnel mines. The area had been marked by previous survey teams using the traditional metal detector method before the equipment failure. Marcus established a baseline at the field's edge, marking it with white stones. From there they laid out a grid using string and stakes, dividing the area into 4-meter squares. Each square would be systematically cleared, documented, and marked before moving to the next. The actual clearance was painstakingly slow. Marcus lay prone at the edge of the first square, extending his wooden pole ahead of him. With his free hand, he tossed a light probe stone in a gentle arc, watching where it landed, how it bounced, listening to the sound it made against the soil. Toss, observe, listen, mark. Each grid square received dozens of probe tosses, building a map of the ground's response. Areas that seemed suspicious received heavier test stones, bounced at specific angles to apply pressure without weight. 3 hours into the operation, Marcus identified his first mine. The indicators were subtle, a slight depression in the soil, vegetation growing in a circular pattern, the way test stones bounced asymmetrically off the surface. He marked the location with white stones arranged in a clear pattern, and carefully withdrew. The mine turned out to be a PMN-2, a Soviet-era anti-personnel device containing 100 grams of TNS, exactly where Antonio's method had indicated. Word of Captain Webb's unconventional method spread through the peacekeeping force like wildfire. Initially the response was mixed. Skepticism from the technical specialists, curiosity from the field commanders, outright mockery from some of the career officers, who saw it as a rejection of modern military doctrine. Marcus ignored the politics and focused on results. The first minefield was cleared in 6 days, longer than it would have taken with proper equipment, but infinitely faster than waiting for replacement detectors. 27 mines were identified, marked, and safely removed. 0 casualties. The second field took 4 days. The team was learning, improving, developing instincts that combined Antonio's traditional wisdom with their modern training. By the 5th field, they had refined the method into a systematic doctrine. Marcus documented everything: the training procedures, the observation techniques, the stone testing sequences, the safety protocols. What had begun as desperation was becoming a legitimate alternative approach. Before I continue with this incredible journey, I need to ask something from you. Drop a comment below telling me, have you ever had to solve a problem without the tools you were trained to use? Your stories inspire me to keep sharing these incredible accounts of human ingenuity. Lieutenant Rodriguez proved to be a natural teacher, taking Antonio's methods and translating them into military-style training modules. She established a certification program, ensuring that every person who attempted mine clearance using this technique had demonstrated proficiency under controlled conditions. Sergeant Johnson developed improvements to the stone testing sequence, categorizing different ground conditions, and creating a decision tree for which testing approach to use. His background in demolitions gave him insights into how different mine types responded to various pressure applications. Corporal Martinez, meanwhile, became their specialist in vegetation analysis. He could identify with remarkable accuracy where mines had been buried based solely on how plants grew around them. It's not magic, he explained to skeptical observers. It's basic botany. Metal leaches into soil. Chemical explosives change pH levels. Plants respond. You just have to know what to look for. The international media eventually caught wind of the story. A CNN crew arrived to document what they initially framed as a controversial primitive method being used by UN forces. Their reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Wu, came prepared to expose dangerous incompetence. What she found instead was rigorous discipline applied to unconventional technique. Marcus granted her full access to the operation, confident that transparency would serve him better than secrecy. Jennifer and her crew spent 2 weeks embedded with the engineering unit, filming training sessions, observing clearance operations, and interviewing everyone from Antonio to the newest recruit. The resulting documentary Stones Against Steel won international acclaim and fundamentally changed the conversation about mine clearance in post-conflict zones. Jennifer's reporting emphasized not just the effectiveness of the method, but its accessibility. It could be taught to local populations, using materials available anywhere, at virtually no cost. But success brought its own challenges. By the 16th minefield, Marcus's unit was exhausted. The mental strain of mine clearance was intense under any circumstances, but this method required a level of sustained concentration that took a severe toll. They were finding mines, successful clearances continued with 0 casualties, but the human cost in stress and fatigue was mounting. Marcus called a 3-day stand-down. His people needed rest, and he needed to confront a problem he'd been avoiding: scalability. Antonio found him sitting alone one evening, staring at maps of the remaining 27 minefields. "You carry the weight of the world, Captain," the old man observed, settling down beside him. "I'm responsible for these people," Marcus replied. "Every time they go into a field, they're trusting that this method, your method, my adaptation, will keep them alive. What if I'm wrong? What if we've just been lucky?" Antonio was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know why I showed you this technique? Because we needed help and had no other options." "No. I showed you because I saw in your eyes what I saw in my father's eyes, the weight of necessity. Not duty, not glory, not pride, necessity. The understanding that someone must do the impossible because people will suffer if it remains undone." He gestured to the maps. "You ask if you might be wrong. Let me ask you this: were you wrong in the first field, the 5th, the 16th? No, but were your people careless, rushed, unprepared? Never. We maintain the strictest protocols." "Then you are not lucky, Captain. You are careful, you are wise, you are thorough. These are not the same as luck." Antonio tapped the map. "In Proverbs it is written, the horse is made ready for the day of battle, but victory rests with the Lord. You prepare, you train, you do everything within human power. The rest is faith." Marcus felt something unlock in his chest. He'd been carrying not just responsibility, but the arrogance of believing he controlled outcomes. Absolutely. Antonio was right. He could control preparation, discipline, and training. The rest required trust. "We need to expand," Marcus said suddenly. The solution crystallized. "We need to train more teams. Not just our unit, local people, community members who want their land back." Antonio smiled. "Now you understand." The training program expanded dramatically. Marcus partnered with local NGOs and community leaders to identify volunteers, farmers, teachers, former soldiers, anyone willing to learn. Antonio led the cultural and traditional aspects of the training, while Marcus and his team handled the military precision and safety protocol. The results were transformative. Within 2 months, they had trained 40 local mine clearance specialists. These weren't just workers following orders. They were skilled technicians who understood the theory behind the practice, could adapt to different conditions, and had deep motivation to succeed because they were clearing their own community's land. The pace of clearance accelerated dramatically. Multiple teams working simultaneously cleared the 17th through 35th minefields in just 8 weeks. The local teams operated with a confidence born from both technique and territorial knowledge. They understood the land's history, knew where battles had been fought, could predict where mines were most likely to have been placed. The 43rd minefield was different from all the others. It surrounded the ruins of a small church, destroyed during the final days of the Civil War. According to local accounts, it had been a refuge for civilians before it was shelled. After the building collapsed, both sides had mined the area to deny it to the other, a senseless act that served no military purpose but had rendered the site inaccessible for years. The community wanted the church grounds cleared not for farming or commerce, but for memory. They wanted to rebuild, to create a memorial, to reclaim a sacred space from the violence that had consumed it. Marcus stood at the edge of the site with Antonio, now 83 years old but still sharp as ever. The old man had participated in clearing all 42 previous minefields, teaching, guiding, encouraging, but his health was failing, and everyone knew this would be his last operation. "It's fitting," Antonio said, looking at the ruined church, "that we end where faith lived." They had assembled the largest clearing team yet, 12 of Marcus's military engineers and 20 local volunteers, all fully trained and certified. The field was relatively small but densely contaminated. Initial surveys suggested over 60 individual mines in an area of approximately 1,1200 square meters. The clearance began at dawn on a day that felt charged with significance. Marcus had performed this operation dozens of times now, but something about this final field felt different, heavier, more consequential. They worked in pairs, each team taking a grid section. The familiar rhythm established itself: probe, test, observe. Hours passed in concentrated silence, broken only by occasional calls to mark a suspicious location or confirm a find. By midday they had identified and marked 41 mines without incident. The work was progressing smoothly, methodically, exactly as it should. Then Corporal Martinez, working a section near the church's collapsed eastern wall, made a discovery that stopped everyone cold. "Captain, you need to see this." Marcus approached carefully, following the marked safe path. Martinez was kneeling at the edge of his cleared zone, pointing at something barely visible in the disturbed earth. It wasn't a mine, it was the corner of a metal box, military grade, deliberately buried. "Could be a cache," Martinez said quietly. "Weapons, ammunition, maybe explosive. Or it could be daisy-chained to mines," Rodriguez added, joining them. "Classic trap for mine clearance teams." Marcus felt the weight of decision pressing down again. They could mark it, call in specialists, wait for proper equipment to investigate. That would be the cautious choice, the by-the-book choice. But something Antonio had said months ago echoed in his mind. "The earth speaks if you listen." This is it, the moment everything was building toward. But before I reveal what Marcus found in that box, I need to know you're with me on this journey. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this story ends. Marcus examined the ground carefully. The box was near the surface, barely covered. Around it the soil showed none of the patterns they'd learned to associate with mines. No drainage disruption, no vegetation changes, no settling depressions. "I don't think it's trapped," he said finally. "Look at the placement. It's not positioned tactically. It's centered, deliberate, like it was meant to be found eventually." Using his wooden pole with infinite care, Marcus cleared soil from around the box's edges. It was approximately 30 centimeters square, made of weathered steel with a latch that had rusted but not fused. Antonio had made his way over, moving slowly but with determination. He looked at the box, then at Marcus, and nodded. "Open it," he said simply. Marcus worked the latch free and lifted the lid. Inside was a Bible, water-damaged but intact, and a handwritten letter. The letter was in Portuguese, dated to the final week of the war. Marcus read it aloud, his voice catching on the words, "To whoever finds this, this church was a place of hope. When the shells fell, we knew we were going to die. We buried this before the end came, praying that someday, someone would care enough about this place to clear the mines and reclaim it. If you are reading this, then that day has come. The Bible inside belonged to our priest, Father Miguel. He died protecting the children. We ask only that when you rebuild, you remember that even in war, there were people who tried to choose love over hatred. May God bless whatever future you create here. Rosa Fernandez." The silence that followed was profound. Every person present understood they were holding not just a message from the past, but a sacred trust from the dead to the living. Antonio's eyes were wet with tears, and the scripture says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." You are peacemakers, all of you, not because you carry weapons, but because you remove them, not because you wage war, but because you heal its wounds. The clearance of the 43rd minefield was completed 3 days later. They found and removed 67 mines total, everyone identified using sticks, stones, and careful observation. 0 casualties across all 43 minefields. Over 200,000 square meters of land returned to safe use. Thousands of lives protected. The church was rebuilt over the following year. The community chose to incorporate stones from each of the 43 cleared minefields into its foundation, a physical reminder of the land's redemption. Father Miguel's Bible was placed in a position of honor,
along with Rosa Fernandez's letter. At the dedication ceremony, Marcus stood alongside Antonio, watching as children played in a courtyard that had been a killing field just 18 months earlier. He thought about his grandmother, about the faith she tried to instill in him that sometimes seemed so distant during his military career. "You were right," he told Antonio. "It was never about the tools, it was about understanding them completely and having faith in their purpose." Antonio smiled. "And now you teach others. That is the true victory, not that you cleared the mines, but that you showed the world it could be done, that you gave people back their power to heal their own land." Marcus's primitive method went on to be adopted by mine clearance operations in 15 countries. The training program he developed with Antonio became a template for community-based post-conflict reconstruction. The documentary Stones Against Steel was used in military academies worldwide as a case study in adaptive problem-solving. But for Marcus, the real measure of success was simpler: the sound of children's laughter in places where silence had reigned for years. Antonio passed away peacefully, 18 months after the 43rd minefield was cleared, surrounded by community members who honored him as a hero. At his funeral, Marcus spoke about David and Goliath, about wisdom and faith, about the power of combining ancient knowledge with modern discipline. "Antonio taught us that technology is not advancement, understanding is advancement," Marcus said. "A stick and a stone used with wisdom and purpose defeated what millions of dollars of sophisticated equipment could not, because in the end, the most sophisticated tool we possess is the human mind guided by faith, discipline, and love for our fellow human beings." The 43 minefields of Angola became a symbol of something larger, proof that impossible problems could be solved, not always with more resources, but with deeper wisdom, that the tools don't define the craftsman defines the tool. And in a rebuilt church where children now sang hymns in soil once soaked with violence, a Bible and a letter stood as testament to a simple truth: that redemption is always possible, that death can be transformed to life, that the patient work of clearing away danger, stone by stone, can restore hope to even the most devastated places. Marcus Webb continued his work for another 15 years, training mine clearance specialists across 3 continents. He never forgot the lesson Antonio taught him that evening in an Angolan village, that David's victory wasn't about the stone, but about understanding that sometimes the simplest answer applied with absolute mastery and unwavering faith is the most powerful weapon of all. The land remembered, the people remember, and in 43 places where death once waited beneath every footstep, life grows again, planted, cultivated and nurtured by those who had the courage to believe that even the most primitive tools, in wise hands, can move mountains, or clear minefields, stone by stone, step by careful step, until the killing grounds become gardens again.